Good afternoon. I'm Rob Wilson Black, the Chautauqua Institution's new Director of Religion. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Hall of Philosophy for Day 3 of Week 2 of the 2026 Interfaith Lecture Series. Yesterday, our time with Elizabeth Diaz was extraordinary, and tomorrow afternoon will be no different with Christianity Today's President and CEO, Nicole Martin. Before announcing today's speaker, Naomi Riley, in conversation with the Chautauqua Institution's Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer, Deborah, I want to ask you to please consult the Chautauquan Daily newspaper for details about the outstanding and varied programs of the Department of Religion, in addition to these interfaith lectures Monday through Thursday at 2 p.m. I would like to especially highlight the Chautauqua Dialogues discussion groups, Mystic Heart Meditation, Islam 101, Courageous Conversations on Death and Dying, Labyrinth Walk, Peace Poll, Healing Services, and too many more programs to mention, and our amazing denominational houses and religious organizations, 22 of them. Thursday morning worship here in the Hall of Philosophy tomorrow morning brings back an old tradition from Chautauqua, a faith journey conversation with the chaplain of the week, the Reverend Dr. Bob Henderson, this week. Every Friday at 9:15 a.m., ecumenical communion here in the HOP. And then 12:30 Juma prayer in the Hall of Christ. What's more Chautauqua than that? And then 5 p.m. Shabbat service in Bell Tower Park, and the 7 p.m. Palestine Park tours. If you've not done that, I recommend it. Everyone is warmly welcome to these Abrahamic Friday events. On Sunday afternoon at 4:30 p.m. over here in the Grove, we have children's worship with a rain location, good for today, in the Hall of Christ. And blessing of the animals after that at 5:15, weather permitting. There is a moderated Q&A following today's lecture. Please submit your questions online via questions.chq.org or on a slip of paper, which we can hand out later. The nearest restrooms are underneath the Hall of Philosophy on the Cookman side, and assistive listening devices are available. For any additional accommodations, do please let the ushers know. Please, finally, silence your cell phones and buzzing devices, and no flash photography. Now, for those joining us via Chautauqua's YouTube channel, thank you. To view live captions during today's lecture, visit captions.chq.org on any internet-connected mobile device. As you may know, our religion theme for the week is Truth, Trust, and the Sacred. Within Week 2's broader theme, Breaking the News, Charting a New Media Landscape. Today, we are very honored and pleased to have with us Naomi Riley. Naomi Schaefer Riley is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on child welfare and foster care issues. Specifically, her work analyzes the role of faith-based and community organizations in changing the foster care and adoption services landscape. She also studies how race, class, and family structure affect foster care placement and services, and the impact of the drug crisis on child welfare. She's currently a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum as well. Riley's books include No Way to Treat a Child, How the Foster Care System, Family Courts, and Racial Activists Are Wrecking Young Lives, and the book Be the Parent, Please. Stop banning seesaws and start banning Snapchat. Strategies for Solving the Real Parenting Problems. Her book, Till Faith Do Us Part, How Interfaith Marriage is Transforming America, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. She was interviewed by Brian Lamb on C-SPAN about her book, The Faculty Lounges, and Other Reasons Why You Won't Get the College Education You Paid For. That's tough for my family to hear. Riley is a frequent contributor to a variety of publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. She was previously a columnist for New York Post and an editor and writer for The Wall Street Journal. Her work has also appeared in Bloomberg Opinion, The Boston Globe, Commentary, First Things, Los Angeles Times, National Review, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy, among others. A regular guest, you may know, on television, her appearances include C-SPAN, Today on NBC, Fox News Channel, Fox Business, CNBC. Today's conversation is made possible by the generous support of the Arthur and Helen Raycroft Memorial Religious Lectureship Fund. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Naomi Riley in conversation with Deborah Moore.
Good afternoon, Naomi, and welcome back to Chautauqua.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I've been very excited about this conversation. Naomi and I got to speak a little bit this morning, and I had such a wonderful time getting to know a little bit about how you became Naomi Schaefer Riley. You're a prolific writer, that I thought we could open up sharing that story with our friends and community here today. You've spent so much of your career studying institutions that shape our lives, religious organizations, schools, families. How did all of this begin? How did you get interested in this path?
So I didn't know that I was going to go into journalism, and I certainly didn't know that I was going to write a lot about religion. I had a pretty conventional religious upbringing. I was raised conservative Jewish. I had lots of friends who were not Jewish, but we didn't really spend a lot of time discussing religion. And my first internship out of college was at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And there was a story I was telling you about that outraged me, which is, how a lot of journalism begins. There were two young women who I'm pretty sure were in Tennessee, and they were inducted into the National Honor Society. And when it was learned that they had each had a child during their senior year of high school, they were subsequently ejected from the National Honor Society. And I found this outrageous on a number of fronts. There was a piece that sort of defended the National Honor Society and said, we care, the organization cares about character. I said, okay, I believe that, but what happened to the men who fathered the child? Anyway, no one had an answer for that. But I went to an editor at the time and I said, I want to write a piece about this. And he said, well, you should find an angle to write about, some way to just do more than just express your opinion. He said, why don't you call these young women and ask them about their religious beliefs? The articles had sort of made it clear that they did not believe abortion was an option for them. And so he said, well, why don't you ask them, what they believe about this? And I said, you want me to call a couple of people I don't know and ask them about their religious beliefs? That's insane. I said, that's rude and obnoxious, and we don't discuss such things. And he said, well, you want to be a reporter, you better figure it out. So the Wall Street Journal at the time, at that summer, it was the summer of 1998, had just launched what was called the Taste page. And on the page was a Houses of Worship column, which still appears once a week on the Journal's editorial page. So sure enough, I called these young women. I got their contact information. I don't even know how. And I started asking them questions. And it was the most fascinating conversation. And I thought to myself, wow, there are all different kinds of reporters you can be. You can be, do the police beat. You can report on funding for the transportation department. But boy, I could call people and out of the blue ask them about their innermost beliefs, like where they think they're going in the next life, and I just thought, I'm going to do this. This is amazing. And then I thought, wow, it's too bad I didn't take a single course on religion in college. So anyway, that sort of launched me down this road. But I still find it to be just the most amazing conversations that I have had over the last more than a quarter century with people about what they believe about this life and everything in it.
So with you interviewing people and following trends and researching for the last quarter of your life, where are you seeing Americans put their trust when we hear over and over that we are losing our trust in institutions? Where are we putting our trust?
So after that sort of thing, the next thing I did was I spent a lot of time researching religious colleges, and I really started focusing, I guess a lot of reporters do this, is you sort of start to talk to people at either the stage of life you're in or sort of the one that's just over the horizon, because you kind of want to know what's coming, and now you have an excuse to ask people. And so I started thinking a lot about young adults and religion. And what I found was really, I think young adults were really longing for kind of the local connection, face-to-face connections. As we are much more, of course, online, I think people are really putting their trust in the community that they can see in, and not necessarily in the kind of overarching structure of religious denominations, but in their community churches and synagogues and mosques, and feeling like, you know, these are the people I know. And the question is like, you know, there is something much different about that than the relationship that people have, let's say, to a denominational structure. So I would say people are still willing to put their trust in local institutions.
Do you see people having an actual decline in participating in religion, or do you think that people are simply practicing religion differently? Are we finding different outlets that you would consider religious?
I think there really has been a decline. I mean, I am sad to say that. I'm sure that there are different ways that people are trying to do this, whether it's, you know, watching, you know, you can watch services online, you can watch us online. But I think in terms of, you know, how much people keep that up, you know, they might experiment here or there, you know, watch a preacher or, you know, try to maybe participate or maybe do their own meditation or things like that are on their own. But I think there is something about the actual going to a service, and people feel obligated, and they not in a bad way, because of course we always now think about obligation in a bad way, but that they feel like these other people, they expect me to show up every week, and they'll be disappointed if I don't. And I think that it's very hard to, I think, practice religion in the way we think of in America in a vacuum. And I think it doesn't have the same impact on your own life and your own community when you try to do that.
Let's go a little deeper on that. Could you talk to us a little bit about what function that you saw religious institutions serving in terms of what's missing now without participating in that as strongly as a community?
So, you know, one of the things that I was mentioned, I write now a lot about child welfare. So I started writing in particular a lot about that in about 2018. I had just returned from writing a book about American Indians. I had traveled around the country, different tribal territories, and it started off as a book about understanding poverty in these places, but actually one of the things that struck me most was the child welfare situation in some of these communities. So when I came back to New York, I started writing more about child welfare, and you know, I'm happy to expound on the problems with the system, but one of the few bright spots was, I think, what faith-based institutions were doing about this issue. And they were, they really, I think, started a kind of revolution about 15 years ago. I think, you know, probably not very visible to most people, but they looked at the kind of way we were trying to recruit foster parents in particular and said this was not very effective. This is sort of, you know, put up a picture of the child on the nightly news and see if anyone raises their hand. This is not a very good way of advertising. This is called broadcasting instead of narrowcasting. And so a number of churches decided, well, you know, we believe in caring for the orphan, and what are we going to do about that? And so what you had all of a sudden was a few pastors decided, I am going to preach from the pulpit about the need for foster parents. We have a shortage of foster parents in every state in this country. And so they would get up in the pulpit and they would say, we have 6 kids in our zip code who need a home tonight. And what are you going to do about it? And it was a real sense, I mean, talk about obligation. But they did a lot more than that. They said to the states, which are kind of notoriously bad at training and recruiting foster parents, like, you would think that given the shortage, if you called the state and said, I want to be a foster parent, that someone would call you back? No, that often does not happen. So the churches said, you know, we will actually take over some of the training if you want. Like, you give us everything you want a foster parent to know, and then we will add some things too, because by the way, just having a certain number of fire extinguishers in your house is not actually the only thing a foster parent should know. And so they started adding like trauma-informed care and all sorts of other things to the training. And then the final element that they decided to add, and this is so, it's so hard to do this outside of a religious community, and I'm happy to talk about why that is. They added support. So about half of foster parents quit within the first year. And it's a really hard thing to do. And so one of the reasons that they quit is because they don't have the support of their community. It's very hard on marriages. It's hard on the other children in your household. And so what these institutions did was they said, some of them said, you want to be a foster parent, you should bring 5 people with you to training. You could neighbors, your Bible study partners, your relatives, whoever it is, and we're going to train them too. And then we are going to say to them, what do you commit to do on behalf of this family? You can sign up to do respite care. You can sign up to make them meals. You can sign up to pray for them, whatever it is. And so, there's this, everybody knows, like, when something terrible happens and you say to somebody like, oh, let me know what I could do. The person never calls you because, they don't want to be the one. So this is sort of kind of putting in place the commitment ahead of time. Anyway, there were amazing results from these institutions, and now they have this model of recruit, train, and support foster parents, adoptive parents, and by the way, and families of origin too for these kids, has spread across the country. It hasn't spread in the Northeast as much as I would like, but maybe if I talk about it enough, I'll fix that.
So here you are telling us about this incredibly successful movement. And if we zoom out, here we are in a week on truth, trust, and the sacred. We've been hearing about how religion is in decline, how there's lack of trust for religious organizations and other institutions. And you're giving us this great example of something going right. Who are these churches, and why aren't more religious institutions catching this model?
It's a good question. It's a question that I really asked myself when I started reporting on it. One question I had in particular was the Catholic Church, which I think a lot of us think of as historically, having cared for a lot of orphans, whether it's through institutions or, donations to organizations like Catholic Charities and things like that. I think what was interesting there is that, and I talked to a lot of, a number of church officials about this and pastors, and I think the difference is that a lot of parishes had gotten into the model of, we're giving financially to support this cause, but you can't pay your way out of our foster care crisis. Like, there's a huge need for philanthropy in this area, and I don't want to discourage anyone from giving to organizations that do help foster kids. But you need people who are actually going to raise their hand and say, no, I will take a child into my home. And I think in part you need a little bit of a lay-led organization in order to have that. But then I started to wonder, okay, well, there are other, organizations besides, the Catholic Church that are much more lay-led. So I thought, for instance, of the Mormon Church. That's an organization that everybody knows has a very strong lay leadership, and they're always raising their hands to help out in a religious and civic way too. And I talked to somebody, talked to a few people. I was out in Salt Lake City, and I said, so why isn't there more foster care being done in the Mormon Church? And the woman said to me something that really struck with me, because I thought it applied to why it wasn't true for Jewish institutions too, was that she said, we have a culture of high achievement for our children here. And it's really hard to try to bring up a foster child who has experienced neglect, abuse, serious trauma, and, constantly being in conversations with people where it's like, what did your kid get on their SATs? Because that's not, suddenly that's not your measure for a child's success. I mean, not that it should ever be your measure for a child's success. I'll just put that out there. But, your understanding of what this child's milestones are, that they should be, well adjusted, that they should be able to, sit in a, let's say, religious service or a school without, outbursts, without hurting themselves, without hurting other people. Like, those are things, it immediately kind of puts you on the outs, I think, in your community. And so one of the things that these churches I was talking about have done is they have created what they call like a foster-friendly community. Like, everybody now understands, because there's a critical mass of these families, what to expect. That if you hear a child like, having an outburst in church, it's not an excuse to like everybody turn around and start whispering and try to get that family to get out. It is, how can I help? Like, what can I do? And this is totally expected behavior.
So do I have it right that these are the mega churches that have this infrastructure in place that's really creating community and bringing up community? Can you share with us any other examples you're seeing in other types of religious institutions that you think should be replicated? Other positive examples like this?
You mean other examples of, like, besides outside of the foster care world?
Outside of foster care.
So, I mean, a lot of the institute, I think in this sense, these large churches did have the infrastructure to do it. Although there are some smaller churches that did it too. And it's amazing to like go into a church of like 100 or 200 people and realize that 25 families are doing foster care. I mean, that's incredible. But I do think, like, in terms of building trust in institutions, it's about that kind of local community connection. So one of the churches that I visited for the book Got Religion that I wrote about young adults and religion was a Redeemer church, what are called church plants. So, and I remember having this really interesting conversation with the pastor, and he basically said, once our church gets to about 200 people, like, I think, especially if you're going to be outside of like a certain radius, you should go start another church. Like, I don't actually want to grow our church to 5,000 people, because I think we're going to lose something in terms of the community. And one of the things that the young adults, I think, really liked was the idea of running into people from church in other parts of their lives, like just walking around the neighborhood. Church was not just something you did on Sundays. Like, it had to be something where you encounter these people. And it really got you out of it sort of brought back much more of a parish model of religious life, that you lived in this area. I mean, this is very similar to, what Orthodox Jews experience. If you have to be able to walk to your synagogue. And so that means there's a certain radius outside of which you're going to go join a different synagogue. And I think, that's how Catholic parishes used to be organized. And, as much as I think, our modern sensibility is to find that very restrictive and, well, what if I like that place better? It does create this sense of community and obligation to this group of other people that we don't have as much now.
We also find sense of community, of course, in our families. And you've written Till Faith Do Us Part, exploring the rise of interfaith marriages. Talk to us about the reasons behind the rise in interfaith marriages. Is it because people have less faith, or is it because we're learning how to navigate with each other better?
So I think certainly it's because we have become more secular. I think it's also because, we are learning to navigate this better. But I think the most interesting finding from that book, and I did a national survey, I commissioned a national survey for that book. And the most interesting finding, I think, was that the older you are when you get married, the more likely you are to marry someone of another faith. And I think the reason for this, when you think about it, is clear. The time in your life when you are most secular is actually the time between when you leave your parents' house and when you settle down and start to have a family of your own. Family and religion are just very integrally related, and there's no way of separating the two. And so what happens is, the longer time you have, in your early 20s, late 20s, even to early 30s, where you're living a secular life, that's the time now when you're meeting your mate. And I don't think people are trying to deceive their mates, by the way, but I do think, you represent yourself in a certain way. And so somebody meets you and they think, oh, she says she's Jewish, but I never see her go to synagogue, and maybe she goes to a Passover Seder every once in a while, but this is clearly not something that's very important to this person. Or, you meet somebody and they think, oh, they're like, they like Christmas and Easter, and I can live with that, and it's fine. But then that person goes to settle down, and then we, revert. I don't mean in a negative way, but in a positive way, like to the childhood and the rituals and the habits that we've known when we were growing up. And then that does sometimes create conflict, because suddenly it's like, oh, this person I thought I knew, for whom this wasn't really important, now it becomes more important. Some people realize that, like, at the moment they go for premarital, wedding counseling or something like that. But it was shocking. I think more than half of interfaith couples that I surveyed did not discuss the faith of their children before they got married. And I just thought, well, that's definitely a risk, because think about all the other things that you do discuss. One of the things that I found really surprising was that our rates of interfaith marriage have gone up at the same time as our rates of interpolitical party marriage have gone down. And I here's my theory is that we talk about politics a lot. Like, if you get to a third date with someone without knowing their views on, like, let's say Donald Trump, gun control, abortion, whatever it is, it's kind of surprising at this point, because everybody's wearing their politics on their sleeve and they're not wearing their religion on their sleeve as much.
So there must be things for us to learn from interfaith families that are negotiating all of these things well. You mentioned holiday traditions, but of course there are many religious traditions that could come into family life. Where do you see those healthy negotiations in an interfaith marriage that could help us navigate some other things like political differences outside of family life?
So I would say one of the things that was surprising to me, is how much people sort of think of interfaith marriage as like, oh, even if you talk about, let's say, how you're going to raise your children, you think, oh, that's like, okay, that's one decision. I have made this decision, and now we can just move on with our lives. In fact, it's like you could be negotiating this every week, basically. Like, are our kids going to go to Hebrew school? Are our kids going to go to vacation Bible school? What charities are we going to give to? What kinds of summer camps? What kinds of rituals are they going to celebrate? Which institutions are we going to join? Who feels welcoming? Who doesn't feel welcoming? Are we going to go to Uncle So-and-so's house, even though they bloviate about God knows what, and we don't really want to listen to that? I think that the fact that it's an ongoing negotiation means, obviously you're married to this person, so it has to be a continuing conversation. And I think maybe with our political conversations, we sort of end it very quickly, probably because we don't really have to continue to participate in the ways that you do in a marriage as much. But I think that sort of sense of, like, there's probably some more nuance here that we're missing. And if we had a longer conversation that was, let's say, even in the context of a long-term friendship. I have, there's a woman I've played tennis with now once a week for about 10 years. And we are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but we have in common our love for tennis. And I find that, like, we have very interesting conversations that are not, we don't offend each other, but we're very honest with each other about what we think about politics. And I think that if you can sort of find some other reason to bond with a person and then use that as a basis to then have conversations about issues you disagree with, that's obviously more helpful.
As you know, here at Chautauqua, we commit ourselves to an interfaith community. And we would like to think that having these conversations doesn't mean that everyone comes with a watered down faith, right? That you just meet in the middle and you compromise. We'd like to think that people can stand securely in their own faith and have those rich conversations with each other and learn from each other. Do you think that's possible in family life, or does it become so personal that there has to be some watered down meeting of the middles? Or do you see examples in your traveling around the country where people are really holding to faiths in a way that you find uplifting and rich?
I think it's really hard to not sort of meet in the middle. So, you can have an interfaith marriage that doesn't involve kids and everybody can hold fast to their own faith because everyone can go in their own direction. I think it's really hard to give kids, I would say, two faiths. And and when I talk to children of interfaith marriages, and when I talk to the couples who are trying to give their kids both, I did find, a lot of we compromised on this, we watered this down, we believe that we basically all believe the same thing. And that's a choice you can make. But I think I did, find a few couples who I thought were just fascinating. I'll tell you the story of one. There was a couple that I met. It was a Mormon woman married to a Christian Scientist man. And they had 5 kids who they decided to raise as Mormons. But it was really interesting because, he still held very fast to his own faith and his kids understood that. And I started talking to them about this. And they were very open with me. I mean, people all over this country have just welcomed me into their homes to have these amazing conversations. And this woman sort of, kind of got a little teary about this. And I said, so how do you sort of square this? Like, how do you square, by the way you're raising your kids and sort of the way you talk to them about this? And basically what it turned out is that she thought that, and this was 20 years into their marriage, that someday he would see the light. And, and he was sitting there, this wasn't a secret, and he was like, who knows, maybe it'll happen, but, probably not. And it was sort of interesting. They had, I think they had a clear patience with each other and understanding that they had very different worldviews. And he didn't mind. By the way, in lots of interfaith couples, one member of the couple does convert. Maybe not after 20 years, but sometimes after 20 years, by the way. Like, if they have been welcomed into a community and have been participating in that community, and they feel like their children have been welcomed in that community, sometimes it happens. And this woman just had a very, strong sense that this is not in my hands, this is in God's hands, and I don't need to pressure him. I think she had a couple of missionaries come over the course of the decades to see if they could, just lean on him a little bit, but, he was fine with that. So I think it's possible in that sense. I think there is an element of patience, but, if you want to sort of hold very fast and principled to your views. But I think even in their case, it was clear that they made a decision about their children and how their children were going to be raised.
Well, let's stick on raising children. And this week on Truth and Trust, would love for you to share with us a bit about where do families look for truth? And how do we talk to our children about being able to distinguish between truth and misinformation?
Oh, well, you heard my book about taking phones away from kids. So I have a lot of...
You write a lot about
yes.
digital distractions.
Yes. I think, again, it's about creating those face-to-face relationships with your kids, putting them in settings where they do feel like they are part of a community and where they can trust the adults in that community to impart the truth that you want your kids to have. I think we have to both be the parent, but also think about who are all the other people around our kids. Especially, so our oldest, we have a 19, 17, and 14-year-old. And, when I announced that to our, now 19-year-old that she wasn't getting a phone before she was 14, I had to find some other families who kind of believe that too. And that was a lot harder to find, let's say, 10 years ago than it is right now. I think now we are sort of in, very fortunately, a kind of backlash against the give your kid a screen at 3 kind of phenomenon. But I think whatever your view is, it's important to have that critical mass because, your kids are not, gonna think you're right about everything no matter what. And they want to be part of a community that, shares those values. They don't always want to be the odd man out. Like as an adult, I don't mind being the odd man out. I often am. It's it's fine. I could live with that. But, your 8-year-old does not want to be in that situation very much. And so, finding other people who share the same values and seeing about, getting that critical mass is really important.
So I suppose I ask this as a mother, as far as how you push back about certain community insistence on using social media. For instance, I've had many conversations with parents of, well, we tried to hold back the phone, we tried to hold back Snapchat, but every single sports team event or party invitation comes on Snapchat, and I don't want my child to feel isolated. How do you balance that isolation and fitting into their peer group versus what you feel should be certain boundaries?
Well, I mean, this drives me absolutely up a wall. I mean, the fact that the schools are responsible for forcing your kids into technology so much. I mean, when our older two started middle school and, the teacher would literally tell them, take a picture of this assignment that's on the board with your phone. And they would come home and tell me this because they had no phone. And they're sitting there writing it out, you poor child. But I have to say, I mean, you obviously have what's best in mind for your children, and you should fight back against those institutions. Like, I have had conversations with teachers, principals, coaches. I have run for school board. Like, I have done all those things to try to make sure that we push back on this automatic assumption that every 7-year-old has a phone. It's really important. But as I said, the other important thing is finding other people so that your kid is not always left out of these things.
So you write about digital distraction, raising children in a positive way, and you also have this deep history in looking at religious institutions, trends, patterns. Is there a connection there? Are there religious institutions that are creating certain efforts to address raising children in a world of digital distractions? Do you see a direct connection?
Yes, but I think they're not doing it in a helpful way. I mean, a lot of religious institutions immediately, when social media became, this phenomenon, is like, oh, let's put our service online. Let's let everybody read their Bibles on their phones. Let's, have social media followings. Like, I think people were going to religious institutions not for that. I think they're going for something different. Like, I talk to religious leaders a lot, and I don't have polls, but I would say, like, I really think if people are going to make time in their week, in their day for a religious spiritual experience, it's because they're not looking for more time on phones. I would also argue it's probably because they're not looking for another political speech, by the way, that they're actually looking for something different. And you can provide that different thing, but you have to be a little thoughtful about it. So, I mean, I would say, to the extent that our institutions can provide an alternative, can provide that face-to-face connection, I think they're probably going to do better, especially among young adults.
I'm so struck by the idea that when you take a problem like that, let's say digital distraction, that I think most people agree has grown to be a problem, not just for children, perhaps with me, perhaps with you, that when we have that, it takes a coalition of groups, right? Not just a family, not just a school, not just a religious institution, but it takes several different groups coming together to say, regardless of our strategies or regardless of our perspectives, we all have a shared goal. And I had a mind blow experience with you this morning when you talked about the temperance movement. And I would ask that you take us back to that moment as a coalition of people with a shared goal.
So the next book that I have coming out next year is about the impact of the drug crisis on children and families. And this is really a lot of my child welfare work. Just to give you one statistic for the day, up to 90% of the families involved with the child welfare system are suffering from a substance use disorder, alcohol or drugs. And so thinking about this, I really started going back and looking historically at the temperance movement, which gets a bad name, I think, because of people's view of prohibition. But the temperance movement was actually something separate from prohibition. It wasn't just the laws. It was 40 years at least of attempts to change public messaging and ideas that the public had about the dangers of alcohol. And what was really interesting to me, I mean, obviously we're in one of the homes of the, original, women's Christian temperance movement. and people sort of know about its religious background, but I don't think people really think about the coalition of groups that came together. And by the way, the reasons that they came together were so interesting. So this group included not only religious people, and when I say religious people, I mean people we would think of today as progressive religious people and conservative religious people. Whether you were concerned about, whether people were getting into heaven, or whether you were concerned about kind of social progress, all of these different religious groups had a really common understanding of the dangers of alcohol. And one of the reasons for that is because it had an awful impact on women and children in particular. You may not be aware of like just how much Americans used to drink, but it was something like 7 gallons a year of alcohol on average for, I think, every American above the age of 15. So that it worked out, I think I did the math, to about 4 to 5 drinks a day. So that's a lot of drinking. And it had a big impact on domestic violence, on child abuse, on just family destitution overall. So here are the groups just that looked at that and said, this is awful. So you had suffragists, you had abolitionists, you had people on both sides, like I said, conservative and progressive religious groups. You had just sort of generally the kind of progressive social movement. Even if you weren't religious, you believe this. And there was just this sense that everyone can look at the impact of alcohol, of excessive alcohol consumption on these families and say, no, this is not working for our country, and we need to come together to do something about that. So, I mean, my attitude right now is if you look at the impact of drugs on children and families, I would hope we could come to a similar consensus. So far, it's not there, but I think it's really important. By the way, you can also see echoes of this in the anti-drunk driving movement. There was a real coalition of folks from religious backgrounds. You had Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There was a strong feminist impulse there. There was a strong conservative kind of anti-crime contingent that came into play there. And I think, everybody can look at certain issues that are having such a clear impact on our families and say, regardless of the kind of how I get there, I really think we need to do something about the problem.
Do you have, I would say, valid hope that you think will move in this direction as you look at the drug crisis, particularly through the lens of family life? Do you see coalitions of group that you think will be successful?
I think there is a sense in which there's some, I don't know, to borrow a phrase, getting mugged by reality in an unfortunate way. Like, I think people have looked at some of the policies that we've had in recent years that have been kind of sold as anti-punitive policies, that we don't want to, punish people for, addiction or, seeing addiction as a disease. And so therefore we can't really enforce any laws around this or engage in any kind of stigmatizing. And they're seeing some of the policies like really backfiring. And I think there is a sense, I think, broadly in the American public, like I'll give an example. There's been a move in a number of states and hospitals in recent years. There are about 500,000 babies who are born in this country substance exposed. So that means drug exposed. Now, so those are only drugs. By the way, we don't really have a good way of testing whether an infant is exposed to alcohol at birth, unless a mother's, literally been drunk within the last, 24, we have no idea. But so these are infants who are testing positive for illicit substances. And there's been a move in recent years to not report these mothers to Child Protective Services because we think it's mean to them, that it's punitive. And so instead, what we do is we engage in something called voluntary plans of safe care. So that means you have a mother, let's say the baby is just tested positive for meth, fentanyl, and that mother, is in a state of obviously active addiction. And you hand the mother the baby to go home, and you hand the mother some brochures that say, here are some rehabs you might want to check out. And then you say goodbye. And there's no follow-up. You don't even record the child's name. You just sort of send them on their way. And if the mother feels that she wants to, get help, she will. But if she doesn't, she doesn't. So New Mexico had this policy in place for about 4 years. The governor, who was a very progressive woman, just said, I'm sorry. She said, we never should have done this. They had on average of about one baby dying a month who had been born substance exposed and sent home with a mother who clearly could not handle this. Now, you can have arguments about, what should happen with that follow-up, whether in some cases that mother is not going to be capable of caring for that baby in the long run, and that child is going to need to be taken to foster care. In some cases, you need to find someone else, like a relative who can take that baby or move in with the mother or something like that. But hospitals are sitting there, trying to make sure that you've installed your car seat properly. And the idea that they're sending you home, with your fentanyl addiction and a newborn to care for without any support is crazy to me.
Naomi, we started today talking about the various institutions, family, religious institutions, schools, and the trend for people to be moving away from organized religion and to lose their trust in institutions, including our religious institutions. Before we invite everyone to join the conversation, can you talk to us about what hope you have for instilling trust again? You mentioned going local as one thing that you are a real believer in. Are there other signs that you see or things you would like to see in how we instill trust again with our religious institutions?
I mean, I think I've probably talked about the biggest ones. I think, religious institutions are a way of, kind of obligating us to one another. The part of the reason for the decline, and we kind of talked about this in the marriage conversation, is that religion and family are very intertwined. And so as you've seen sort of more of a breakdown of family, or people just deciding not to get married, or people deciding not to have children, this is wrapped up in our fertility crisis, in our marriage crisis. So it's very hard for me to sort of say, like, this is the prescription, because I think, if you get married and have children, you're more likely to join a religious institution. But also, if you join a religious institution, you may be more likely to get married and have family. But if you do neither one of those things, nothing is sort of pulling you back into community and the obligations of community. And I'm not saying that there are not plenty of single people who are in religious institutions and volunteering and being part of those institutions. But in terms of the sort of triggers for people that pull them back in, it really is, marriage and having children.
Thank you, Naomi. Friends, as we invite our Director of Religion, Rob Wilson-Black, up to engage all of you in conversation, I will remind you that Naomi is doing a meet and greet and a book signing over at the Hall of Missions afterwards. And now I'll turn it to Rob to remind you how you can participate in the questions today.
Thank you, Deborah and Naomi. And if you've purchased a book of Naomi's and it hasn't come in yet, we also have nameplates, so she could sign those as a part of a meet and greet as well. You can submit questions online through questions.chq.org, or if you'd like to submit a written question, please raise your hand right now, and one of our ushers or Department of Religion staff will bring you a pencil and a slip of paper. All right, so many great questions already come in online. Could you comment on the trend of the federal government to allow the reading of Bible and 10 Commandments in classrooms for children's education and otherwise, and allowing taxpayer money to be given to religious organizations given state and church separation?
So I don't, in terms of reading the Bible, obviously there are a lot of ways, as all of you know, to read the Bible. I think it is a sort of foundational text for Western civilization, and I think it would behoove a lot of young people to have some familiarity with it. And I think there was once upon a time an assumption that that would happen at home. It often doesn't now. So I don't actually have a problem with kids reading the Bible as a text, in the same way they would read the U.S. Constitution as a text. Obviously, proselyte, it's a line, but I do think it's really helpful in order for understanding so much else about our culture and literature and history. And it would be, I think, leave a real vacuum for kids if they were not familiar with it. In terms of taxpayer funding to religious organizations, I think it depends on, what the religious organization is doing. And I think that there's no reason we should discriminate against organizations that have religious missions if they're accomplishing things that the taxpayers have decided it's important for us to do.
Next question. I'm very interested in your take on court cases holding internet platforms legally accountable for terminally online behavior.
Yeah, this is a hard question. I think, primarily the people who are, I assume this is about kind of children and, and holding internet companies responsible for children's activities online. I think that, the primary responsibility here is always going to be with the parents. But I have to say, these companies have made it awfully difficult for parents to exercise the oversight that they want to be able to. So, I think that there are serious First Amendment issues here, but in the same way that, we've restricted, the distribution of pornographic magazines, 50 or 60 years ago, I don't have a problem with restricting, certain internet usage among kids today.
Do religious people get a bad rap? People seem to think all religious people are judgmental, bigoted, and intolerant. Is your experience, is this your experience, and is it unfair?
Well, to continue my husband's comments from earlier, I think that is a very common media portrayal of religious folks. I don't think a lot of folks who are in the national media spend much time, certainly not as much time as I do, kind of traveling around the country, visiting different kinds of communities, talking to people. I think that there is often a caricature out there in the media. And then if you then haven't met the people from that particular religious background, you're going to take the word for it of whatever media outlet you've been reading.
Given the problem of maltreated children, how would you follow foster care children to minimize this problem for them? Are there solutions?
Oh, sure. Yes. There are a lot of solutions. I think that we need to take maltreatment very seriously. I know that sounds obvious, but I think there's really been a movement in recent years to suggest that these kids are not really experiencing maltreatment. One line that you hear a lot is that it's not neglect, it's just poverty. I can tell you there are a whole lot of poor people in this country, and they do not mistreat their children. So I'm talking about a very specific subset. And the maltreatment of children is not just physical or sexual abuse. Neglect is a real thing, and it's a real thing, unfortunately, that's very much tied to substance abuse and mental illness. Parents who cannot care for their children, particularly young children. Many of you, of course, know how taxing it is to care for a baby or a child who is, not rational enough to know that they shouldn't touch a hot stove or jump into a bathtub or swallow Legos. Now imagine trying to do that if you're experiencing addiction. It's really, really hard. And these kids, there are more than 2,000 maltreatment fatalities in this country of children every year. That's more than backyard drownings, school shootings, child cancer deaths. But there are very few people who are focused on that number. So I would say, really kind of having serious child welfare investigations, really understanding the risks posed to kids by drugs, by mental illness, by domestic violence, and understanding that there are going to be times where, parents need a lot of support, intervention, surveillance, and there are times when foster care is going to be necessity. And we have to have like a very realistic conversation, I think, about that in this country, and not one that's just sort of like, well, this seems like unfair to parents. Like, I think we really need to think about the child's best interests.
I have two questions which are somewhat related, so I'll do them both together. I I connect with you as a parent in limiting access, media, and screens. Do you see different types of institutions approaching screen use and youth differently? For example, are religious schools more proactive than public? And how can we hold public institutions accountable? And the other question asks, okay, if we do ban in public schools smartphones, isn't that more government control of our lives? And how do we reduce that?
So, I mean, on a personal level, I mean, we have done public, parochial, and secular private schools, and I would say there's not a consistent through line in terms of understanding the dangers of smartphones and screen usage. I will say that the Jewish day school that our kids were at for a little while, definitely saw the problems earlier a little bit, but they were there for a few years before anyone was noticing, except for me. I was screaming about it from very early on. But I have to say, like, I think it really has to do with the culture of your institution and less about sort of the way it's funded or how it was founded. In terms of, banning the smartphones in schools, like I think this is really one thing where just a real consensus finally emerged, because, you talk to teachers and they did not want the smartphones in the school. You talk to the parents and they, for the most part, didn't want them in school. And so, this was an issue, but I think it took a long time for everybody to trust everybody else. There were some parents out there who were saying, well, how will I contact my kid in the case of emergency? I mean, honestly, if you are, if you think that the way to help your kid in case of emergency is for you to be on the cell phone with them, you should probably take your kid out of that school, because it means you don't trust the adults who are on the premises to be able to usher your kid to some kind of safety. And the idea that you on the cell phone is going to be better at that is, I think, should be a cause for concern. So in terms of what, how to move forward on that, I think, again, it's about building a critical mass of people who agree. And I don't think that preventing kids from using cell phones during school hours is a form of government control that I'm opposed to anyway.
The Milton Hershey School in Hershey, Pennsylvania has a hard time now finding orphans for their schools and are funding and finding kids from broken homes. Do you find this typical in society? And also, child labor laws prevent them from giving these kids chores to do to help them learn life skills.
So the history of orphanages and institutions in this country like that is really interesting. I think a lot of people, when they find out what I write about, they said, "So do you think we need to bring back orphanages?" Newt Gingrich was high on this a couple of decades ago, I don't know if you remember this. I've talked to people who are probably in their 80s and 90s now, who grew up in what were then orphanages. A lot of the reasons that they were in orphanages at that time was poverty. Like, they were living in extreme poverty and their parents couldn't care for them. And we didn't really have a safety net in this country that was really going to enable some of their parents to be able to do this. There's an economist at UC Irvine named Richard McKenzie who's written kind of a memoir of his time, and he's done a lot of interviews with other people who grew up in orphanages at this time, like let's say 75 years ago. And people ask him, how did you succeed in life despite being in an orphanage? And he said, "Oh, I succeeded because I grew up in an orphanage." So I think there is a sense in which these institutions can be helpful, but we have swung entirely in the other direction now. We have kind of a war on any kind of residential institution going on right now. And if you've read in any of your home states about children sleeping in child welfare offices, in homeless shelters, children who are being put in juvenile detention even though they might not have committed any crime, we have what's called a children without placement crisis. These kids in particular are kids with serious emotional and behavioral problems. And as much as we might like to be able to find a foster family right now for them, a lot of these kids need 24-hour supervision. They are at risk of harming themselves or harming other people. And it is really hard to depend on a foster family, just like it would be hard for any of us to care for our own children if they needed 24-hour supervision. And so I think we have moved way too far away. We don't have the residential placements, even temporary ones, for some of these kids who really need serious psychiatric interventions or help. The other group for whom I think it's important to have some kind of residential care available are teenagers. If you talk to teenagers in the foster care system, they've been bounced around a lot in some cases. A lot of them don't want to be placed in a new foster family at the age of 15 or 16. Like they don't want to have to adjust to a new set of rules every time this foster parent, doesn't like what I'm doing or something like that. They would much prefer to be living in a group setting with like 6 or 8 kids. Let's say, a married couple who's the head of this, this home, where there are, supports that are coming in. They have dinner together every night. They do chores. You're allowed to, ask them to clear the table or things like that. And that is actually a much better preparation, they feel, some cases, for adulthood than just going to yet another foster home.
It's helpful. Here's another twofer. Is there a current problem with Child Protective Services being too zealous? And what one change is needed in federal, state, and local policies to improve the foster care system now?
Oh, I think we have the opposite problem. I think we have a kind of hands-off attitude. It's not just a hands-off attitude. There is an ideological problem here where I think CPS is taking a very much hands-off attitude. Like the cases that many of you read about, that make the news are, family lets 9-year-old walk to park by themselves. Child Protective Services picks them up and tries to take kid into foster care. When I tell you that is like the exception, I can't even tell you. The vast majority of kids who are taken into foster care are under the age of 3. So these are not like the free range kids who they're under the age of 3 and their parents are dealing with addiction. Like that is overridingly the characteristics of most CPS cases. So I just want you to understand, like those cases that make the news are the exceptions. I would say, one thing I would really like to do is have us have a better assessment of risk. Our CPS workers, some agencies have a 40% turnover rate. These are not people who are being well-trained. They're not people who are often well-qualified, and they're not doing investigations in the way that like we would expect law enforcement to do investigations. If one thing I would do if I could wave a magic wand is actually have people who are interested in going into law enforcement take a different track and say, if you're interested in this, maybe you would like to do child welfare investigations, because I think the level of professionalism, the kind of things that you're trained to do when you're an investigator or detective for law enforcement is much better training than what we're asking CPS workers to do. I'll give you one anecdote. I was talking to a state child welfare secretary recently who told me about a conversation she had with a worker, and they were looking at this case, which seemed quite egregious. The secretary couldn't believe that this child hadn't been removed from their home, and she started asking the woman who did the initial investigation, did you ask the family about this? Did you ask the family about this? Did you ask the family about this? And the woman said to her, the investigator said to her, well, that seems kind of nosy. And so, when I just tell you, like, we are not asking the right questions, and I'll just add one like little advertisement here. Last year, I started a website, data project with in conjunction between AEI and UNC Chapel Hill. It's called Lives Cut Short. You can go to livescutshort.org. It's a very depressing homework assignment for you, but we have now 5,000 cases of child maltreatment fatalities from 2022 to today. That's not nearly all of them, but we have put in there all the narratives that we were able to get. And by the way, we have to fight with states to get these. And we have now added an AI tool so that you can actually do a search for all the different risk factors, whether it's drug use, past criminal history of parents, whether this child was in foster care when they died, whether the parents have, whether it's a mother's boyfriend. Unfortunately, that is a common risk factor. So I would just like the public to have a better sense of what are the risk factors for children, and how we can do a better job protecting them.
Thank you. I want to go to from the micro to the macro. Do you have the sense that humans are getting, on the whole, appreciably better over the centuries, worse, the same, or unknown?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty conservative about this. I think human nature remains pretty constant.
Beautiful. My friends and I cannot understand how religious people can support any administration who does not clothe the naked, feed the hungry, heal the sick, or house the homeless. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think the question is how you go about doing that. I mean, so I live in the suburbs of New York City. We have, as many of you know, a new mayor there. And this past winter, about 30 New Yorkers froze to death. They froze to death because they were homeless, and the mayor decided that under his administration, we were not going to force people into shelter. So, I think you could say, oh, the, progressive mayor, he must be so compassionate. And I look at that and I think people who are under the influence of, drugs to that extent don't actually know what's best for them. And it's the job of the government to say, actually, we're not going to give you a choice about this because we don't want vulnerable people to freeze to death. So, yeah, I don't really have a problem with the overarching idea that government should be providing a safety net to all these vulnerable people. The question is how you do it.
In our final 3 minutes, here are 2 questions. You can take them as you like. How is marriage doing as an institution overall? What can people of faith do to strengthen it? And the second one is sort of related. What are your thoughts, if any, on the so-called trad wife movement or trend?
So I think marriage as an institution is not doing great just based on the numbers in terms of how many people are choosing to get married. Obviously, there's a big class divide on marriage in this country. People who are, families represented here are much more likely to get married and have all the benefits that come from marriage, not just economic ones, but social ones. And people who are on the other end of the economic spectrum, unfortunately, are not getting married in the same numbers. So, what do I think we should do to support marriage as religious institutions? I mean, one thing we could do is, set up more young people on dates and encourage them to get married and talk about, I'm serious, and, talk about, the benefits of marriage. I mean, I think, again, this is an area where I think the media does a terrible job. Like all these stories about not only how awful marriage is, but how, depressing and oppressive it is to raise children. Like I just think that trickles down into people's thinking. And I think that's a problem. But I also think, you need support in your marriages, like, of your friends and of your family. And so to the extent that people are struggling in their marriages in these communities, I think it would be great for religious communities. And they do this in many cases already, but to be able to provide that support. I think the trad wife movement is kind of it's a social media phenomenon. I don't think it's really it certainly doesn't affect me very much. Anyway.
Naomi Riley, thank you so much for being with us. What a treat. Join us for book signing, meet and greet, and thank you, everyone. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah.